Welcome to our webinar series, which is part of RITRAIN, the EU-funded research infrastructure and training program. I'm Enrico Guarini from the University of Milano-Bicocca, and today you will be hearing about some governance issues in managing large-scale research infrastructure. On this topic, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Iain Mattaj, Director General of EMBL, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. First of all, Iain, thank you for sharing today your knowledge on this subject. And moving to the topic of our conversation, recognized definition of governance is concerned with creating conditions for ordered rules and collective actions. So what would you say is your biggest governance headache in managing an organization like EMBL?
Yeah, I think you have to distinguish between external governance and internal governance. And I will start with external governance, which is, I would say, where many of the headaches come. So we have many member states. The member states obviously all have different wishes. They would like EMBL to deliver them different things. But the member states are not constant. In each of our member states, there are elections which happen every 4 or 5 years. This can result in quite significant changes to the research policies of these individual countries. It can result in quite significant changes to the research funding of the different countries. Obviously, apart from that, there are economic crashes which can affect these things also. So I think the biggest headache is that nothing ever stands still. One has a negotiation with all of the member countries, makes a decision, and then 1 year later, one of the member states comes and needs more information about why are we doing this, what is in it for them, what do they achieve by being part of this. And so there's a constant requirement for updates of information, a constant request to change the way that we do things in order to accommodate their needs. And that, I would say, it's not impossible, but it's an ongoing challenge to keep up with these changes. Internally, I would say that EMBL works remarkably well, considering that it's located on 6 different sites. There are something like 1,800 people working. They come from 80 different countries. They come from different scientific cultures, life sciences, mathematics, physics, chemistry, etc. But in my view, they work together usually very well. So there, I think the interface between the administrative side and the research and service and infrastructure side is the interface which needs to be constantly monitored and constantly improved.
So, moving to the external governance that you mentioned before, what's the role and importance of lobbying as a Director General activity?
Yeah, so I think it is important to lobby, and I think we agree that lobbying is not a negative activity. I think EMBL achieves a relatively good idea of what the life science research community needs and wants. And so because we're in a position to discuss with our member countries, with the ministries in the member countries, with the research councils in the member countries, and we're also in a position to discuss with the European Commission, we can help to inform them about what we think the research community is asking for. We can help to advise them on which funding programs might be the most useful, what might be the best way to fund a particular area of research. We don't do this alone. Many people are involved in these discussions, both nationally and at a European level, but I think it is very important to be part of this process to try to influence framework programs like Horizon 2020, to help to influence the content in a positive way on behalf of the community that we serve.
I think this is part of your job, and I wonder how do you organize this lobbying activity within different scientific groups within EMBL?
So I think that there are different levels of the organization. So we have a Director of International Relations, and she has overall responsibility for organizing this activity in relation to the national states and in relation to the European Commission. So she has a staff, not a large staff, but a few people who really understand how the European Commission works, how some of the member states work. When do you need to talk to them? What is the best way to influence them? What's the best way to have your opinion heard when new policies are being determined and planned? So that is one major level, and probably the highest level at which we engage. But of course, we have many individual researchers and people who run individual parts of our research infrastructures. And they also are experts whose voice can be influential when funders are thinking about what should we do next, what would be the most useful way to fund in this area. And so many of the individual scientists within EMBL also are involved in these lobbying activities. It's not by any means that I do most of it or do all of it. I am engaged in it, but there are also many other levels at which this happens.
I think this is an important issue also for the new research infrastructure in the preparatory phase, moving to the construction and then the operational cycle of their life cycle. So it's very important to think, to organize this and arrange this function, the organization level.
And if I may say there, I think one of the things which these organizations this is why RI Train is so valuable, because there is a very limited number of people who have experience in running intergovernmental research organizations like this. And it's very important that more people are trained, because there are now many new organizations. Those organizations, however, are also not existing in a vacuum. So there are organizations like EMBL, like CERN, like the European Southern Observatory, etc., etc. There are intergovernmental research organizations of various types, which I'm sure are, many of them are very willing to help the new infrastructures when they have questions, if they need advice. And I know that as EMBL, we have been involved in discussing with several of the biomedical science research infrastructures about what kind of governance they need, what kind of activities do they need in order to be successful.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned before about the importance to link the stakeholder interest with the mission of the organizations, but sometimes stakeholders have multiple and diverse, sometimes contrasting interests, especially in budget decisions.
Absolutely.
So what are the main challenges on these issues, and how have you addressed some critical situations in this perspective?
So I think what you're saying is very true. I think if you have 23 voting member states, you will have 23 different opinions on what is the most valuable thing that EMBL can do. And so I think one aspect that's very, very important in bringing people to a consensus is to openly discuss the fact that different member states have different needs. Small member states have very different needs from large member states. Many of the things which EMBL can offer could, in principle, be offered by Germany or the UK or France, because they have a very large budget and they have a very large community. But many of the smaller countries could not possibly set up the facilities which are run by EMBL, certainly not all of them, maybe one or two, but not all of them. And so I think one thing is to keep the member states in the discussion so that they realize they have different interests and they have different requirements from EMBL. And then to try to reach a consensus about how can we achieve something which is of value to all of our member states, even though not any of them will get exactly what they would wish for if they were designing the series of activities that we do.
So I think in this perspective, the scientific side of this negotiation and leadership exercise matters a lot, right?
It matters a lot because, of course, we can only do so much, and we don't claim to cover all of biomedical science. We don't claim to cover essentially any of medical science, but we provide infrastructures which are, of course, useful to medical researchers as well as basic researchers. So the discussion of the scientific program is also a complex one, but essentially the organization exists even if we have turnover, so that people, the group leaders, for example, the research group leaders, leave after 9 years. There is an existing set of activities, and I think the secret of planning for the future is to realize that you are somewhere and you don't start in a vacuum. So you have to be able to plan new things, but you have to be able to plan on the basis of the expertise which exists and the interests which exist within the organization, but to plan these in such a way that the member states get something new over a period of time from this activity.
As you know, Iain, governance mechanism requires some formal mechanism and some informal one. So according to this job of leading the board of directors or the member states in different interests, what is most important, the formal mechanism or informal mechanism sides of the governance?
I think both are probably equally important, because I think it's very important to informally discover what are the limits in any discussion that an individual voting member state has. So where is the point at which a member state will say, no, this is something which I don't agree with, which I will not vote for. And this can only be done, sometimes this comes out in a formal debate when council meets. But usually this comes out in informal discussions, either during the breaks from the formal meetings or in meetings away from the EMBL council meetings. And it's necessary to keep a dialogue, to keep understanding what the countries want in order to present something for decision which is capable of achieving a positive vote. I think it would be extremely negative for any intergovernmental organization to push for a vote on something where it's clear that the member states will not support it. It only takes one vote of no to lose a lot of confidence of the member states in the organization and in the way that it's governed. So one has to be very careful not to push too hard, even if there is something you think the member states should want. If they don't want it, you have to accept that that's the case.
On these issues, I wonder if you have experienced some situation of conflicts which have been provided negative effects on the operation of the organization?
I think not negative effects, but it's quite clear that when we discuss, for example, the program of activities for 5 years, it's very clear that some countries will be very supportive of X, but don't want Y at all. And other countries, it's exactly the reverse. They would be very happy if we would do Y, but they don't want X. And I think that can be difficult, but actually it also can help, because if you can bring this discussion into the formal meeting, it's very clear that not all of the countries will get everything they want. And I think that realization and the fact that the countries want to achieve something together also helps you to reach a consensus and to reach a final decision, because everyone understands everyone else is making compromises also, and therefore we have to also compromise with some of our wishes.
Moving to another type of interest, I know that EMBL, like other research organizations, interacts with industry.
Yes.
So on this side, what kind of approach and governance mechanism EMBL have taken
Yes.
to avoid conflict of interest or conflict of mission?
Yes. So here we have rules and regulations which govern how we can interact with industry. But I would say the fundamental pillar of our interactions with industry is that EMBL would not carry out contract research. In other words, we would not be interested if a company came and said, we want this kind of research to be done, we're willing to pay for it, will you do it? We would only do research with industry if there also is an interest of the organization in this research. So we work together extremely well with industry in many areas, but always on the basis that this has to be something which is of mutual interest. A further wish is that things should be as open and as transparent as possible. So we have a very well-developed collaboration with companies from the pharmaceutical industry, a project called Open Targets, where together with pharmaceutical companies, EMBL and the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, another research organization, chooses research problems which are related to disease and tries to understand better the molecular mechanisms which lead to these diseases. These projects are chosen jointly, but all of the data which is produced in the joint work is immediately published in data resources and eventually in journals. So this is it's open target. So this is pre-competitive research, and it's very easy for us to engage in. It would be difficult for a research organization like EMBL to engage in competitive research, but what we do instead is we develop the tools to set up a company, and then we have a technology transfer company, EMBL Enterprise Management, which can take this research, and the researchers can continue to be advisors to the company and set up a company separately from EMBL. EMBL may have a partial ownership of this company, but the research which is then done in the company and not at EMBL. And finally, we have many collaborative projects where there is something that we're interested in, that companies are interested in, and these include technology development projects. So in microscopy, for example, we work together with several companies which build microscopes and sell microscopes to develop the next generation of certain types of microscope. And this sometimes, again, leads to new commercial products which the company will build and sell. But also sometimes it's done, again, at a pre-competitive level where the idea is to develop something and to make it available to the community.
Who is in charge within EMBL to take this kind of partnership within industry? So
ultimately, I would decide that. So ultimately, that would be a decision I would have to take. In other words, I would have to bring in for discussion the people who are directly involved. If this involves interactions with a company, we would also be advised by our technology transfer company. The researchers who are involved would be involved in this. We have a legal department. The legal department would be involved in making sure that everything is being done legally according to our rules and regulations as well as to those of the company. But ultimately, the final decision would be for the Director General to take.
Okay. As you know, using large amounts of money sometimes some failure may occur,
Yes.
especially we have a lot of cases in the
Yes.
private sector and business sector. So I wonder how important is the internal auditing function in an organization like EMBL?
Yeah, so yes, and let me put this into context in the sense that we have an internal auditor, we have external auditors who are appointed by the member states, and we have auditors, external auditors who are appointed by other funders who fund us. And all of those are important. Obviously, EMBL is spending public money ultimately, and so it's very important that this money is well spent and that the expenditures are well controlled. So what's the part of internal audit in this? One thing is to look at all of our financial activities and to check that this is being done legally and that this is being done well and that money is not being wasted, that there is no theft of money or misuse of public funding. But the second and equally important aspect of internal audit is to look at the processes which we have in place for controlling expenditures and for making sure that our financial and human resources departments work with the best processes. And they advise the Director General and also tell Council about the things which they have found which could be improved, which are in need of improvement, and they also advise the Council on how did EMBL respond to the request for these improvements. So just to make it clear, the internal auditor is appointed by EMBL, but is an independent position. And the internal auditor gives the reports to the departments on which the internal audit has been carried out and to the Director General for action.
On this issue, are the scientific leaders of research projects managing the budget, or it's in charge of the administrative office?
So the scientific director of a research project decides what the goals of the project are and how the money can best be spent in order to achieve these goals. In other words, which staff are required, who should be paid from the project, what equipment is needed, what running costs will be required, and so on, and for distributing the budget between these different layers of the project. Overall, in fact, the organization is responsible, however, to the funder for taking care of the money. And so the finance department of EMBL looks after the way the money is spent, make sure that the money is being spent again in a legal way according to the rules of the funder. We have many different funders at EMBL, and so there are many different sets of rules, and the finance department is responsible for informing the leaders of the projects what they can do and what they cannot do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have a strong experience, a long-term experience like research, in managing research projects, and then you have moved to a managerial top-level position. So I wonder, in terms of governance mechanism of research projects, what of this mechanism can be helpful for governance structure and mechanism of the whole organization?
Yeah. So I think the important thing to realize as one has to take on more and more responsibilities is that it's impossible to know every aspect of what one is responsible for in detail. So this means two things. The first is it means one has to delegate activities to other people, and one has to trust those people to deliver. So what that means is that it is also necessary to build mechanisms and to have enough knowledge, to know enough, to know when the trust is justified, so that you have to have ways of getting feedback on the performance of people. So this sometimes can lead to very difficult situations where senior people are not delivering what's necessary, and then there have to be sometimes very difficult decisions about whether that person can continue, whether the performance can be improved, or whether this is the wrong person for the position. But I think it's really about learning how to delegate, how to trust, and who to trust.
Okay. So could you please summarize some take-home lessons from this conversation on governance, especially on the design of a mechanism and rules?
Yeah. So I think the governance of an organization has to fit with the organization. That means it has to fit with the funders of the organization. It has to fit with the staff of the organization and their goals. It has to fit with the overall direction in which, if it's a research organization or a research infrastructure, in which that field of research is operating. It's necessary that a governance structure should be stable. It would be very difficult to completely create a new governance structure every few years. And it's very important that all of the actors, all of the stakeholders have the feeling they can communicate with the organization, communicate their needs and their wishes, and that the organization will understand them and also try to answer them in a positive way. Within the organization, I think it's important to learn that there are many different facets to running a research infrastructure, managerial as well as scientific, and that one has to choose the right people to be in charge of these different domains of activity, and then to let them have conditions in which they independently can give their best effort to the organization and be appreciated for doing that.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining today and sharing your knowledge on this topic. Thank you again.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.